Mike Nelson joins the Plutopia podcast this time. His research focuses on internet governance, technology standards, innovation, and data policy.
Don't get involved in a policy debate where all the arguments on your side are classified at a top secret code word level. And that's why I don't think we're going to solve some of these surveillance problems. And we're going to see other countries building surveillance states and pointing to the U.S. and saying, well, we know the U.S. is listening to everything we do, so we're going to do the same and listen to all those dissidents who might threaten the power of the elites. And the other problem is that we're not using those surveillance capabilities to close down corruption. Corruption doesn't start with P, so it's not on my list, and it's not an emotional issue, but it's certainly hurting people. And I had hoped 20 years ago that the internet, the sensors that we're building, the citizen journalism, all of that was going to expose corruption and really change how societies are organized. But it seems to be going just the opposite way.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Plutopia podcast. I'm Jon Lebkowsky, one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined by other co-hosts, Wendy Grossman and Scoop Sweeney. And we are very pleased to welcome our guest today, Michael Nelson. Mike is a senior fellow in the Carnegie Asia program. And is that still current? Are you still in the Asia program?
I was in the Technology and International Affairs program and officially moved over to Asia because that's where I'm doing most of my work now.
Fantastic. And Mike studies the implications of emerging technologies, including digital technologies, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence, which we've been talking about quite a bit lately. So welcome, Mike. And Wendy, do you want to lob the first volleyball?
Let's also welcome Scoop. Hi, Scoop.
Yeah, welcome, Scoop.
Hello.
Well, I first encountered Mike at the Computers, Freedom, and Privacy Conference in the mid-90s. And at the time, then as now, access to encrypted text was and is a huge bone of contention between those of us who think that people should have privacy and law enforcement who insist that they should have access to everything. And then didn't see him for probably about 15 years. And then one day he popped up at another Computers, Freedom, and Privacy conference, all washed and shiny and in a different job. So Mike, do you want to give us a short idea of your career trajectory? How did you get from the Clinton White House to Carnegie? And
well, it's been a series of interesting turns. I started out as Al Gore's science advisor when he was Senator Al Gore. And we wrote the legislation that said normal people can use the internet too. We made a mistake. We didn't also write that abnormal people should not be encouraged to use the internet. But until about 1992, there was the acceptable use policy, and you had to have a good friend working at a university or a federal lab or a contractor that would give you a connection. Of course, it wasn't really well enforced, but in order to get investors to build other networks to tie into the NSF net, there needed to be legal authority to make those connections. And we all know what happened, incredible explosive growth over the next 4 or 5 years. We got into the White House at exactly the right time. The web had just become a commercial thing, had started to scale. The whitehouse.gov website was one of the first 6,000 websites, and it really was one of the very first government websites, at least a national government website. And it just was a wonderful cascade. Every governor decided they had to have a website. Every CEO was yelling at their CIO, asking why Bill Clinton had a website and they didn't. So it was a very heady time. Excuse me. We didn't have to worry much about cybersecurity, and the website, despite not having a lot of sophisticated defenses, wasn't hacked until after the Clinton administration, I believe. but it was a much easier time. We were talking about maybe hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, maybe billions. And today we're dealing with trillions. And of course, back then, the internet wasn't having geopolitical consequences. It wasn't bringing down governments. It wasn't being used to change election results by changing voters' attitudes. And there's a lot of things that have developed that we didn't anticipate. No one anticipated LOL cats, for instance. A lot of us did anticipate online dating and video conferencing, things like this. But
well, quite a bit of those things were already happening on CompuServe anyway. I mean, this is one of the things people forget, is that an awful lot of CompuServe really did pioneer e-commerce.
yep.
And people don't realize, because it was a small enclosed, relatively small enclosed community. But
and they did it at 2,400 baht.
Yeah, but I went to the 50th anniversary reunion of CompuServe employees a few years ago. And there's a couple of guys out there who are sitting on a database of software patents that were filed by CompuServe. And what they spend a lot of time doing is going into court and telling people that the patents they've just filed are not valid because.
Thank God for prior use and good document.
Prior art.
Prior art.
I should point out that Kevin Driscoll wrote a book. I'm ditching on the name of the book, but it was a book about the BBS world prior to the internet and how that shaped a culture that carried over into the internet. So I think the BBS world was definitely a source of some of the cultural weirdness that we found on the internet.
John Markoff didn't go quite as far back, but he has that book, What the Dormouse Said, which is also delightful. And I also like Mitch Waldrop's book, which was a much more comprehensive look at 1955 all the way to about 2000 and how the computer and the internet grew together. But yeah, Wendy, you're right. Back in the days when we were in the Clinton White House, we were trying to deal with some of the same issues we're fighting with now. And my job back then was the same as my job now: try to stop stupid policy, often by finding a third way to frame the issue. And key escrow and Clipper chip didn't work, but it was at least better than what the FBI was pushing. They were continuing to support export controls on US encryption and limiting where it could be used. And they wanted import controls. They wanted to somehow prevent people from downloading encryption software from servers overseas. And then,
well, this is basically why Phil Zimmerman wrote PGP, was to make it impossible for them to actually make such a law stick.
But that was, as I say, that's how extreme the different positions were. The worst part right now is in most countries, we have 2 or 3 different encryption policies. So just a couple of days ago, the police chiefs in Europe came out and said, nope, end-to-end encryption, got to stop that. They're going to try to close down Signal and other encrypted systems. They're going to try to force Facebook not to encrypt messaging services. I think we're really coming to a head on this, and it's really unfortunate that we can't deliver the message that this isn't a technology that a handful of pedophiles and online bullies and fraudsters are using. This is something we're all using. It's built into the system.
What really gets me about this is they target encryption, but they don't say anything about cryptocurrencies. And the only really solid use case for cryptocurrencies does appear to be ransomware. In which case, getting rid of cryptocurrency seems to me like that would actually get you a lot further.
Or at least substituting something else for it. I mean, if there is a legitimate use, then we could have digital national currencies, central bank currencies, and those are developing. It's not something I spend a lot of time on. A couple of my colleagues, including Robert Greene at the Carnegie Endowment, is a leading expert on who's doing what are the barriers, how is it going to happen. I thought by now we would all be using digital cash. I did a projection looking forward 25 years from 1998. And I basically got 6 technology trends, 6.5 technology trends right.
Out of how many?
7.
Okay.
Well, you mentioned the attempt
Digital
to
cash.
you
Digital
mentioned the
cash.
attempt to shut down Signal, and I just I'm a political junkie, and I've been watching the trial of Donald Trump this morning. And one of the things that came up is Michael Cohen was telling Trump that he had to communicate only with Signal and not on text or anything that can be listened to.
I thought he was telling that to Pecker.
Yeah, well, to Pecker and everyone, basically. Apparently, that was the new marching orders for the campaign to put really nasty stuff onto Signal. And I think people have seen this happening, and they want to shut it down. But there are a lot of people that use it, like journalists use it, so they won't be tracked down by people who want to kill journalists.
Boris Johnson and his team were using it extensively.
I'm actually really worried about Signal, but the reason I'm worried about it is that it doesn't seem to have enough funding. And, lack of funding could kill it quite easily.
Yeah. And then people would have to use Telegram, and we know who runs that.
Well, Telegram or WhatsApp.
Well, WhatsApp is subject to US law, so.
You've gone silent, Mike. I don't know why.
I'm
Oh, sorry. I can hear you.
Okay. But
no, I
mean,
can you hear him?
Yes. Wendy, can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
Something went wrong here.
I'll shout a little louder. But I do worry about the TikTok phenomenon. I don't think banning TikTok is the right answer. Although India has banned more than 100 different Chinese apps because they're just very paranoid that their billion people are going to be using tools that will have surveillance built in. And probably more important, they have tools that could erase all their data with an hour's notice.
They should be required to sell TikTok to Elon Musk.
Well,
it's worked so well for Twitter.
Why would you do that to a whole bunch of younger people who never did you any harm?
One of the more interesting conspiracy theories was triggered by a document that was discovered during the Elon Musk trial when he was trying to get out of buying Twitter. And a White House aide had written a game plan, a point-by-point game plan on how to take over Twitter and basically close it down, ruin it. And there were all sorts of speculations about who would want to do this. One of them was that certain dictators overseas, having seen what Twitter can do, might want to get rid of it and had the money to help fund Elon Musk in that effort. But I'm not supporting this idea, but I can't find any rational way to explain what Elon Musk has done to Twitter. It's absolutely astonishing.
So you honestly believe that dictators like maybe Vladimir Putin or somebody would actually interfere in the U.S.?
Well, that's that's not with money, that's with information. And that is,
well, if they took Twitter down, that would be.
Well, I was thinking more, there's certain countries that have lots of petrodollars, but it is really hard to understand what Elon Musk is doing. And I hope I live another 50 years and everything will be declassified, and or at least maybe 10 years. So at least a couple whistleblowers can come out and we can put the pieces together and understand how he came to that decision. It was
I have to say, I don't think Russia would want to destroy Twitter because I think Twitter is too useful to them as a tool.
Oh, I'm not saying that the conspiracy theories don't point in that direction.
Yeah, I got what you were saying, actually. They're pointing it toward the Middle East.
Yeah, MSNBC did a little piece on this because it was reported quite widely, but it wasn't picked up because there was no other document. There was just this one document, and there was a blog post that kind of said, "Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's close down this." And at the time, the meme was that the liberals control this and they're suppressing us. But the money did come. A lot of the money did come from overseas. Elon Musk didn't throw that much money into it. I mean, a lot of money by our standards. But the other issues that are out there that we had back in 1990, copyright. I have a list. I have the eight P's of cyber policy, and it's protection, obviously, of the systems, pornography, procurement, making sure you buy American or buy domestically, policing, privacy, piracy, payments, and then the last one, when I first mentioned it 15 years ago, was psychology, and everybody scratched their head. And now, of course, that perhaps is the most important.
Well, hang on a minute. What was your first one again?
Protection of the data, protection of the systems.
I should say,
let me explain one thing.
Why isn't protection the same as piracy?
We protect systems for a lot of reasons other than copyright. I'm talking.
Yeah, I know, but why isn't piracy just kind of a subset of protection?
Again, we don't want our systems being knocked down by foreign powers. We don't want earthquakes taking out data centers. I should emphasize, though, the eight P's are the eight most emotional issues. They're not obviously every issue we have to worry about. We got spectrum policy, we got orbital slots, we got certain types of technical standards, which aren't very emotional, but are very important. But I've just used that list, and it's been fascinating how we've made some progress on some of them. And on others, we are just as stuck. And actually, in some cases, we're more stuck because now these are partisan issues and people are on different sides depending on what their party is. In the past, they were more concerned about who their big donors were and which companies had jobs in their district. So that's been the biggest change that I've seen in the last 10 or 15 years. The other big change in both Europe and in the US is that because these used to be billion-dollar questions and now they're trillion-dollar questions, everybody wants to be involved.
What was on your mind when you put psychology on the list?
Mostly the stories about video games and children being addicted to it. Now it's much more than just children, it's everybody. I want to quote something that was said this morning. I got up early so I could tune into the Microsoft Cyber Agora. This is the 4th annual meeting they've done where they explore European policy on digital matters. And one of the speakers, she was the vice chair of the high-level advisory group on AI for the United Nations. And she put it pretty well. She said, the existential threat of artificial intelligence is that we're all going to go insane. We're not going to know what the truth is. Seeing is not going to be believing. Or it was so stark the way she put it. And I think that's right. I mean, it's much more important to focus on how people lose the ability to do critical thinking and to get real facts than it is to worry that AI in 20 years is going to be controlling our critical infrastructure and our weapons.
Actually, I'd be more worried about how much water and energy it uses.
That's
currently.
possible. There's huge incentives to get that right. And NVIDIA's latest so much more efficient.
I'm seeing a lot of stories about data centers being sited in places where there's already a shortage of water, and they're using more than what's left. And I don't think that's a trivial thing. I think people can die over that.
Yeah, but I think they're doing some of that siting knowing full well they're going to be able to do things more efficiently less heat to dissipate.
You have greater.
I
you
worked
have
for
greater trust.
Cloudflare. I worked
You
for
have great-
Cloudflare for 4 years. It was astonishing how much progress we made in making the data centers bigger and more efficient at the same time.
Well, you would think it would be a no-brainer to want to do that, but I don't have the same trust you do in the people running these companies.
Yeah, well, they want to make money, and their investors want to make money, and so if there is a
So
you have to do some calculations. You do have to make some speculations and extrapolations, but I think that problem will be solved. I worry much more about this possibility that we just are overwhelmed with bogus, useless disinformation. And we're already seeing some of this where the models are being trained on data coming out of other
yeah,
artificial
the
intelligence.
term for that is model collapse.
Yeah.
But I'm actually I've come around to being optimistic about that, because if I look back like a century or two, there was a time when people were fooled by projections from magic lanterns, and no one would be now, because we've gotten good at looking at images. And I just, I sort of tend to think that we will find ways to identify what's authentic and what isn't. But what I wanted to ask you was, one of the things you've said in various places where I've seen you, is that in Washington, everything has to have a 3-word slogan. So do you have a 3-word slogan for each of your 8 Ps?
I actually just wrote a paper on this. It was a part of a collection of articles on digital leadership. Specifically, the title is Korea's Path to Digital Leadership. But we looked at Korea, Japan, Malaysia, and the United States. And in describing digital leadership, I went through and said, okay, here are the thorny questions. And there's a pretty good overlap between the 8 Ps and the thorny questions. There's a couple extra ones. And in each case, you can analyze these like a physicist. I'm trained as a geophysicist, and so I tend to look at forces at play. And certainly with ClipperChip, it's easy to see the different forces. You have the privacy community pushing for more encryption. You have the commercial sector pushing for more encryption. But in some cases, they want key escrow, because if a corporate system has really important data, they don't want employees, particularly fired employees, able to take encryption and close down the whole system. And then you have the cops trying to suppress it. And in some ways, the national security surveillance agencies also trying to suppress the use of encryption. But you can do the same thing for a lot of these issues. Certainly with pornography, you've got the people who are saying, wait a minute, the minute you try to close down pornography, the same tools, the same justifications will be used to close down sex education online, or some things that we think are social goods like free speech. So that's what we did in that. And it is, if you really work hard, you can kind of come up with the 4 to 5 syllables for the buzzword, and the 6 or 7 words that explain the buzzword that could fit on a bumper sticker. And that's actually what I'm famous for in Washington. People come up to me and say, oh, I remember you gave this great talk 18 years ago. And I said, well, what was it on? And they look at me puzzled, and they think, I don't remember, but it was all about bumper stickers. And it is unfortunately a problem that the good analysts have not found a way to really boil it down. And often they end up trumped by somebody who does walk in with this, nice, simple, crisp 3 or 4 words and 1 image. You have to have a good image to go with your bumper sticker.
Boris Johnson didn't really need an image to go with "Get Brexit Done," did he?
Well, he had a bus. Had a big
no, the bus was earlier. The bus was during the campaign. It was during the campaign leading up to the referendum. Get Brexit Done was 3 years later, when he was running for the leadership of the Conservative Party and trying to win an election.
But they still use pictures of the bus.
Well, that might have been the media.
And it's also good to have 1 or 2 factoids. preferably true, but usually not. Just one little number or
So do
some
we
graph.
have you to, so do we have you to blame for the dumbing down of politics? Is this what you're telling us?
Well, I always make the point that in order to design a good bumper sticker and buzzword, you do have to do some good analysis. The problem is that the people who design the bad bumper stickers, the misleading ones, they don't do the analysis so they can get their bumper sticker to market a lot faster. One of my distinctions that'll probably be in my obituary is that I was Barack Obama's representative in the first ever presidential Twitter debate. So in June of 2008, I was recruited to make the arguments for the Barack Obama tech policy. And we went up against somebody who was representing the McCain campaign. The Wonket, Anne-Marie Cox was the moderator, and we argued 140 characters at a time because this was old Twitter. There were only about 60,000 people on Twitter at the time. And so at one point I was number 10, I think, among largest number of Twitter followers because of this one event. And we had a fun time, 3 days looking at digital divide, online pornography, e-government, e-commerce. It was pretty hard to do it a couple bits at a time, but if you used your letters wisely, you could sneak in a URL or two.
You mentioned pornography. You have it listed as number 2 on your list, and I would put it at number 1. And I've always upset people in some of our interviews when I mention the fact that many of our favorite and most successful internet applications and services were not really popular until someone said, hey, you can get pornography on these websites or streaming channels, and all of a sudden they go, really successful. But the one thing that I've noticed, even today, text is still king or queen. It's still the leader of ways of communicating, because the testimonies today were being live streamed from the Trump trial by reporters, and they were being reported breathlessly on CNN, and that was text. A lot of the things that are Twitter, or whatever it is now, is basically text. I have multiple grandchildren, and they have smartphones, and when I call them, they're horrified because they didn't realize that you could make a phone call on these phones. So text is still the leader, as far as I'm concerned, in communication.
Well, it's because the interface is so easy, right? You don't have to make sure you have good lighting. You don't have to, take 3 shots at it to get it right. I do somewhat agree with you, but I think about 10 years ago was probably the golden age of video. I mean, it was relatively new. People were finding that they could do cool new things with it. And there are certain killer applications of video, and most of them are pretty unfortunate. They're stupid stunts that sometimes get kids killed, just to get that video of running in front of the train or whatever it is that is the craze of the week. But I'm hoping that we do a better job of combining the two. And we're starting to see that with podcasts, where you get an automatic high quality transcript. The next step is to somehow highlight those paragraphs that are worth listening to, preferably filters that would highlight different parts for different users based on.
But in this podcast, it's all worth listening to.
I know that. That's why I agreed to do it, because I knew the questions would be very good.
So where this actually started was that Mike and I saw a comment. Actually, it wasn't your tweet that I saw. It was a comment to your tweet where you were talking about EU law and stuff. And this guy, it was apparently some EU administrator who was going to give a speech in Silicon Valley, something like this. And somebody commented to it, why Silicon Valley would be bad if Silicon Valley listened to anybody from the EU, because Silicon Valley created, he reels off this list of companies: Amazon, not Netflix, Amazon, Apple, NVIDIA. And this is one of those things that just drives me bonkers, because people think that because there's no billion-dollar or trillion-dollar, computer technology company that's come out of Europe, that Europe never produced anything. But Europe actually produced the web, Linux, the Raspberry Pi, ARM, and I forget what there's
Spotify.
some other
Spotify and
Skype.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of things that came out of Europe, and some of them got bought up by American companies, but some of them weren't actually companies. They were technologies that were set free to create trillions of dollars worth of economic value and to help everyone. And I think the fact that the thing that's overlooked is that Europe has the kind of set of slightly different values around creating things that, has maybe, Tim Berners-Lee, I think, is very, very proud of the fact that both he and CERN agreed they would not charge for web links, so that it became a technology that affected everyone instead of something that was, sort of closed to a bunch of rich people.
I have another list, which is the 7 choices that made the internet. And one of the top 3 most important is Tim Berners-Lee's decision to do that. And a lot of them are hidden. They're things that people never really noticed back when it happened in 1990. Other ones are very controversial today, like all the work about liability, whether we Section 230 and the equivalent laws in Europe. But it's I think really, really excellent that Tim did what he did.
Yeah.
And some of the other alternatives back then could have gone open source, but greedy universities or greedy people decided that they could create an artificial monopoly and keep other.
And I once interviewed Paul Macapetris, who wrote the domain name system.
Yep, that's on the list too.
I asked him what he would do differently if knowing now what he knew then. I think it was when DNS was about 21 years old, and he said, "I'd own it." Well, imagine if they had decided not to make the domain name system open, but somebody had to pay a penny every time they looked up a domain name. I mean, the internet would be complete. I mean, I think the domain names, I think the 2 biggest things that made the internet usable for ordinary people, the domain name system, that are underestimated. And I think the domain name system is one of them, because up until then you had to know all the numbers of the computer that you were trying to send things to. Or get things from.
There's a few things in security that were kind of important, getting rid of the old-fashioned way of doing signatures, passing the digital signature law back in the early 90s. That took a while in some of their countries, and so we had a head start on e-commerce. So there's a lot of funny little choices. This is really a pathway-dependent technology, but it does seem to me, I've been working on this in Washington since 1988 and spent a lot of time in the 90s and actually the last 25 years going around the world talking about this. And it's scary to see how many of these choices that we made the right way are now being undermined. And sometimes it's because there's a force for centralization and monopoly. Sometimes it's because there's a force pushing for government control. What I'm seeing in Europe right now, the one thing that horrifies me most is one of the core provisions of the internet, the core assumptions is that I pay to get to the internet and I pay to get all this great stuff from the internet. And now we have the president of the European Union, a former phone company CEO, who thinks that we should turn it around and have a cable television model where if I have all this great content, I have to pay to send it to all the people who want it. And I have no control over how many customers I have and how much I have to pay. It's, anybody who has an internet subscription can click on the link and download bits from me, and I now have to pay the phone company for that privilege.
That's been the fear
It's
for a long time, that the internet would just
Yeah.
become kind of like cable television. And, you know, there's quite a bit of streaming going on right now. I mean, cable television has moved to the internet.
Well, that's the excuse. The excuse is that somehow these flood of bits from Netflix, particularly high definition video, is going to somehow bankrupt the telcos. But
Well, the thing is,
it's very successful. I mean, there are places that are doing incredible experiments on better compression, and there are better and better ways to move terabytes of data. So it's really quite scary, because underneath what you're really seeing is a game plan by these telephone companies, mostly in Europe, who think it would be great if they were not only a telco, they were also a compco or a cloudco. They want to integrate it all. They want to be able to screen out competition, and they want everybody coming to their cloud service or the service provided by their cloud partner. And that's where you want to be, you know, at least a duopoly, maybe a monopoly for your country.
But all that originated with a guy at AT&T. That it didn't start in that whole idea didn't start in Europe. It was a guy at AT&T in the States who was pushing for it. I don't know, 15 years ago at least.
Well, that was a somewhat different. That was actually more like 25 years ago, where because of the loss of international telephone revenue.
But I honestly don't think. I think what's more at risk is network neutrality. I think that's much more at risk than the notion of what do they call it?
Again, if you have competition, net neutrality is not so much of a problem. You don't need regulatory intervention. And until recently, we had lots of competitors trying to deliver bits in almost every country of the world, and some, well, not every developed country of the world. And with the wireless, although it can't do everything, it can provide a lot of the services that people need. I think you want the result of net neutrality without having to dictate exactly what it is and how it will be achieved. And it's worked pretty well. I mean, the US without regulations, but here we are in the middle of the FCC stepping ahead and saying, okay, we're going to take much more control over how these services are provided. And we'll see how it works. There's going to be a lot of unintended consequences, I fear. And one of them may be that there's less competition and less ability for people to come in with cool new services. That
it's hard to imagine less competition in the United States.
Oh, no, I mean, there's a lot of competition for most of the country. I mean, most of the people in the country. Obviously,
that's not what people tell me. Most of the people I know seem to be stuck with one internet service provider and that they're frustrated with.
Well, no, we didn't follow the road that some other countries did, where their cable company grew out of their phone company. And many places we ended up with two cable companies, at least for a while. And it's, again, I don't say we're the best, but we are meeting the needs for bandwidth, unlike some countries. And while the prices in some cases are too high, particularly for rural customers, we've also gone forward with a subsidy system that I think is the right approach. I mean, the old approach was the federal government and the state governments pay a bunch of money to 2 or 3 phone companies, and that subsidizes low-income users. Now we're flipping it around and saying, okay, no, we're gonna provide payments directly to some of the people who need it, and subsidize services to anybody who can offer to provide it. And I think Israel actually does this better than anybody else. They have a reverse auction for the spectrum. When they set up cell phone services, they went to all the potential customers and they said, okay, we're not going to charge you for the spectrum. We're going to give the spectrum to the people who will offer cell service at the lowest price. And that has actually led to a really rapid rollout to every part of the society.
Well, the problem with competition in this country is as soon as your competitor becomes successful and might be threatening one of the big 3 or 4 corporations in the technology fields, they buy them out. So competition is only around until they became a threat to an Apple or an IBM or an AT&T or whoever. And so competition doesn't seem to last very long. It just becomes, a new part of the big
That depends. I mean, we saw that with WhatsApp, and they sold their company when they were fewer than 25 people, I think. But I worked for Cloudflare, and Cloudflare was founded more than 10 years ago as a DDoS protection service, but also a very effective and fast caching service. They could have sold out, but they are now providing this incredible platform that's kind of behind the scenes. Some people are saying that it's helping cause centralization and giving power to, one more company, but it is true that there are some very ambitious founders who want to have a company that's worth $100 billion, not just $100 million. So it is, I take your point. But again, we keep generating these unicorns that grow up and become new billion-dollar companies or $100 billion companies. And we also are pretty good at coming up with new ways of doing things. I think with the Internet of Things, we have a whole new set of opportunities that people haven't realized yet.
But I think if that was actually where Lena Khan became, who is now the chair of the Federal Trade Commission. That's where she became known, was she wrote this paper on Amazon. And one of the points she made, which I thought was persuasive, is that, up until, say, 10, 15 years ago, you could expect that a top tech company might be toppled by something new being invented by 2 guys in a garage. But that at this point, that's no longer, doesn't happen anymore, because instead, Google just buys them, or Amazon buys them, or Apple buys them. We don't have newcomers coming in and toppling biggest entrenched companies anymore.
Except there are now global competitors like TikTok that have come in.
But that's not, I don't think that disproves her thesis. TikTok is not new anymore. And TikTok didn't topple Facebook.
It certainly stopped.
Not the way Facebook.
It stopped the incredibly.
It didn't do to Facebook what Facebook did to MySpace, for example.
Oh yeah,
It
that's
didn't do to Facebook what Facebook did to WhatsApp. And in fact, one of the great things about the European Union for a while was it was the one place where mergers like Facebook buying WhatsApp and Instagram was actually investigated.
I think we can agree on that. I think we can agree that we need more understanding of what's at stake in some of these mergers, particularly if the idea is to buy the company and pretty much close it down. I mean, that's the most disturbing.
Do you remember how upset we all got about Google buying DoubleClick back in 2001 or so?
It was pretty important.
It was pretty important, and the sale went ahead, and it's one of the things that made Google into the behemoth it is today.
Mm-hmm. Again, we have to leave open the opportunities for innovators. I think one of the biggest challenges is the fact that people are abusing the patent system.
Yeah.
So not only do you have these patent trolls who are out there buying up the most vaguely worded patents coming out of universities or wherever they can find them, but then you have the big companies, not all of them, I mean, probably a minority of them, but ones that aren't innovating fast enough and aren't managed well enough, they turn to patent lawsuits to block people who might challenge their position in the market. Yeah, and that's the piracy piece of this. That's the of my list. Usually we talk about piracy and copyright, but people are also abusing people's patents, and that is something we should prevent. But we should also prevent people from suing small companies 15 ways to Sunday. We had the problem at Cloudflare, and luckily we had some very committed top executives who said, look, we're going to fight this, and we mobilized hundreds, even I guess thousands of engineers to go find the prior art very successfully. It was called Project Django, and they're still using it very effectively to make sure they can innovate and build on technology that's been out there for 30 years without getting sued for it.
The state of Texas has been notorious in its use as a easy place to mess with someone's patent right, someone's intellectual property rights and patents, and having current suits just coming out daily in certain counties here in Texas, and there are people trying to stop that, but I don't see how they ever will, as long as we have a ultra conservative government here in Texas.
Well, I think you can start prohibiting forum shopping, which is what allows that to happen. I mean, it's really it is a peculiarity of the federal system, as we say. But I don't think we pay enough attention to the intellectual property issues, both patent and copyright. And I am worried that we're seeing more and more threats to open sourced technologies, where somebody finds some little subroutine buried inside a complicated open source project and goes after users of the technology. They can't very well. They can't make a lot of money going after the community, but they can certainly go after a lot of money if a major billion-dollar company or $100 billion company is using the technology.
I don't know if you followed the Craig Wright trial here in London. This is a guy who claims to be Satoshi Nakamoto, who invented Bitcoin. And the Crypto Open Patent Alliance basically sued him to stop him from claiming to be Satoshi, because he kept suing developers and harassing them and make, and it's one of those weird cases, because you sort of sit there and think, well, actually, if they win, what happens? There's more cryptocurrencies, maybe this isn't a good thing. But at the same time, you don't really want this guy banging around the world, sort of perpetrating what COPA was saying was a fraud. I will tell you that seconds after the last closing argument finished, the judge said, it will take me some time to release my ruling, but I will say right now that the evidence is overwhelming that Craig Wright is not Satoshi Nakamoto. And so we kind of know where it's going to come down. But my suspicion is he's going to go on to become a patent troll, because they asked him, one of the lawyers asked him what he was going to do if he lost the court case, and he said, I will move on to patents. So that will actually be really interesting.
Well, what kind of patent reform might mitigate these issues?
Well, I'm most concerned about copyright reform, and I'm quite a radical there. I'm for colonial copyright. In the United States, you got a patent. I guess it was initially the Statute of Anne in 1710, and it was only about, I'm trying to remember the exact term. I think it was 10 years. In the U.S., you got a 7-year patent, and you could get an extension to 14. And all the economists who have looked at the impact of copyright on the flow of information and on the use of creative content have concluded that the ideal term of copyright is somewhere around 10 or 15 years. If you actually look at the whole impact, the fact that people can take older content, repackage it, repurpose it, make more money. If you just look at the profits made by Walt Disney and Nashville music record companies, that's a different calculation. And they know exactly how much money they make, and they know how much extending the copyright another 20 years would give them. And that's why we end up with these incredibly long patent terms.
The Mickey Mouse Protection Act.
Well,
Right.
hang on.
Luckily, it's not being extended again. I mean,
Hang on.
at some
You're
point, there
using-
is diminishing returns even for Disney.
The thing is, Mike, you're using patent and copyright
No,
interchangeably, and they're
no,
not.
I'm not.
And I know
I'm
you know
not.
they're not.
No,
But
I said I would start with copyright because I
you would
think the
start with
biggest
copyright.
things are so
When
screwed
I
up.
was
with
when
copyright.
I was first
In both
became
cases, we have a problem with overextending and, taking 7 notes or 4 notes and saying, I've copyrighted this, or taking some very small piece of a technology and some very small piece of a patent and saying, well, clearly I have the ability to block you and close down a product line that is generating tools that 100 million people around the world use every year. I mean, that's
Yeah, I mean, when I first became aware of copyright and songs and stuff like that, the term was 14 years, renewable. No, 28. The term was 28
right.
years, renewable once. And you can't, that's the regime that was in place when the Beatles were writing their songs. So you cannot tell me that the Beatles would have, would produce the Beatles obviously have not produced new music because they have a longer term of copyright available to them, right?
But people argue that because the Beatles' great-grandchildren got to have trust funds, they were more motivated to make the music in the first place.
Well, but the Beatles, like many of these folks, sold their catalogs to somebody else.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the person who actually created the work no longer owns it.
Yeah, to me, that's actually the really pernicious part of it, is that, for example, I have friends who are folk musicians who released albums in the 1970s on a label which is now defunct. And somebody bought up the archives of that label and is refusing to re-release those recordings.
Right.
So, some of them can't work anymore because they've had accidents or health issues, and they can't earn money from the recordings they made in the past. And we can't hear their music.
Mhm.
And I don't see how that is constructive for anybody.
Right. And it's being used as a way to close down competition. I mean, part of the reason that I want to see the Beatles for free is because that means new people have to come up with something new and really innovative to get people to pay for their music. And right. But I really don't think people understand the full picture. There's the propaganda has been so successful at focusing on the lone songwriter who wrote this great song in 1942, and it was unnoticed until somebody pulled it out of the closet in 1989, and they went to the top of the charts.
Yeah, we hear all about Paul McCartney, and stuff, but what about poor Ringo? He wasn't one of the songwriters.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know exactly how we're going to solve that problem given the politics. I mean, one of my rules of politics is when there is a policy fight going on between people who know exactly how much money they're making because of the policy and a bunch of other people who are being hurt in ways that they don't even notice because the pain is spread so far and because it's so obscure. The small group that gets the money wins the day. I mean, it really takes some weird confluence of political forces to undo that kind of situation. Rent seeking is a very, very powerful force in Washington. So is nationalism, more and more so. We're seeing a lot of that around the world now as people are trying to block services from other countries, or in some cases, they're happy to have the service. They're just going to sue them and fine them billions of dollars for various things that they find violate their laws. And that's my favorite example of what I call the Brussels defect. Brussels certainly has all rights to enforce its competition laws, its privacy laws, but they should do it evenly. They shouldn't pick one company over another or one country over another. And that's my biggest complaint about Brussels right now. The second big complaint is that they have 3 or 4 different offices and director generals within the European Union who are pushing for their own answer. In some cases, they're pushing in similar directions, but often we're ending up with 3 different policies, each a little different and all vaguely written. And it's really putting particularly the smaller companies that don't have an army of lawyers at a disadvantage. And that is what you hear from European startups as well. I'm not so concerned about not having unicorns in Europe. Some of that is due to the fact that the venture capital systems and the tax system don't favor startups as much as the US system and Silicon Valley do. One of the bigger problems that's kind of hidden is all the incredible talent that leaves Europe every year. There's a lot of foreign accents, a lot of European accents in Seattle, in Austin, in San Francisco, LA. And it's a real loss.
On the other hand, you have a company like ARM. I remember visiting them in 1991, and one of the guys there saying, we thought about it, and we decided we really didn't want to move to Silicon Valley, and we didn't want to have to raise all the money to build a fab. So we decided we would license our designs instead and stay here and have a nice life in Cambridge. And that's what they did. And it appears to have, they got sold, of course, eventually, but.
This isn't a problem unique to the EU. Canada is exporting a lot of incredibly talented computer scientists.
Well, not just computer scientists, actors. One of the fun things of watching American television shows is spot the Canadian.
Well, we're suckers for accents, whether it's an English accent or a Canadian accent. I haven't covered all the P's of cyber policy, and I hesitate to mention some of them because it seems intractable. These are issues that have been out there for 30 years since I first got involved in this stuff. But well, surveillance is the biggest one. I have a little list of 52 things I learned in Washington, and number 22 is don't get involved in a policy debate where all the arguments on your side are classified at a top secret code word level. And that's why I don't think we're going to solve some of these surveillance problems. And we're going to see other countries building surveillance states and pointing to the US and saying, well, we know the US is listening to everything we do, so we're going to do the same and listen to all those dissidents who might threaten the power of the elites. And the other problem is that we're not using those surveillance capabilities to close down corruption. Corruption doesn't start with P, so it's not on my list, and it's not an emotional issue, but it's certainly hurting people. And I had hoped 20 years ago that the internet, the sensors that we're building, the citizen journalism, all of that was going to expose corruption and really change how societies are organized. But it seems to be going just the opposite way, partly because the oligarchs and the autocrats are getting more powerful. They have more tools to suppress people and to close down dissidents, and partly because the corruption is going to a much higher global level. Most accountants would argue that Putin is the richest man in the world now. There may be richer families, but he is the richest single person because he has just siphoned off so much of the value produced by the Russian economy.
Well, it helps if you can summon your billionaire friends and just to inform them that they're handing over their money, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, Navalny did an amazing job, given his limited resources, of exposing just how much money Putin had accumulated and how he was spending it on outrageous villas and castles and all the rest.
Billionaires in this country have helped prop up a lot of corrupt politicians. We have a few of those here in Texas, and there's others around, but they've
we won't name names. We won't name names.
Yes,
but we need people brave enough to name names, protected by encryption, so that they can not be rounded up. This is again, I'm a cyber optimist. I've been accused of being a cyber utopian. John Perry Barlow was a very good friend of mine, and I was there when he finished the last draft of the Declaration of Independence for the internet. And
I remember those days.
Yeah,
You're a Plutopian. You're a cyber Plutopian.
I would take that and wear that badge proudly.
Plutopia is actually a portmanteau of pluralist utopias. So we are utopian.
Well, the first thing I thought was plutocrat. But I like the term. But it's a tough time being a cyber optimist, because the politics is getting worse and worse, and it's actually limiting the ability to use the technology to solve the problems we really need to solve. And and particularly if we have policies that limit competition, then we're not going to see the innovation that leads to better service for more people in more places. And that's my simple mantra, and I'm sticking with it till the day I die.
Personally, I'd like to see some of the technology companies that have lots of money actually putting it into better things. I have to say that the period of time with all these apps that, as somebody put it, basically take care of you the way your mother did. They order you food, and they get you rides, and they get your laundry done.
Yes.
I mean, I really would like to get away from that and back to solving really difficult, intractable problems. And we don't seem to be doing that. We just seem to be building these just silly little things.
Well,
maybe, we reached the end of our hour. Maybe Mike can come back and we can solve all those problems in the next episode we do with him.
I'm happy to come back and explain AI, because it doesn't seem that anybody else knows how to.
Yeah, we didn't talk about it at all, did we? Let's do that. We'll have an AI episode coming up.
By intention, but I have an article coming out on myths and memes about AI and the damage that they have done.
AI has become the new Voldemort, which we cannot mention.
Well, I would welcome the chance to come back, and I particularly appreciate all the great questions and the chance to talk at length about something I care a lot about.
Absolutely. We'll follow up with you in a month or so, and we'll do another one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Wendy.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Off we go.
Thanks, Mike.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.